Welcome to the video presentation for Chapter 4, Crime Scene Investigation. We're going to talk about specialized personnel who work in crime scenes. We'll talk about criminalists and more in this particular chapter. This kind of reiterates a quote that reiterates teamwork and how teamwork is very important and it applies extremely well to crime scene investigation. We'll talk about crime labs. The types of crime labs, there's 4 different types. Roles of crime scene investigators and the various types of specialized personnel who work in crime scenes. We'll talk about what the difference between a medical examiner and coroner is, what toxicologists and serologists are, safety issues, and procedures that we use to address safety issues. Pardon me. So the first crime lab in the United States was in 1923 in Los Angeles, California. August Vollmer is pictured there to the left, and he was instrumental in many aspects of criminal justice, advancing the field and in crime scene investigation, and was helpful in establishing the crime lab. In 1929 in Chicago, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre kind of helped propel crime labs and crime scene investigation into the modern era, so to speak. Calvin Goddard is pictured to the left there. He was actually a cardiologist who helped determine that some bullets that were recovered from the crime scene at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre were tied to a machine gun that was used by one of Al Capone's men that was also recovered. In 1932, the Federal Bureau of Investigation opened their own crime lab. This is not a picture of their crime lab. They actually opened a new one not too long ago. But this is a picture of the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C., where they're headquartered. So you have different types of crime labs, including local crime labs that are attached to local police departments or maybe even a region of police departments. So, for instance, we have Kansas City has their own crime lab. There's also one in Johnson County, Kansas, that is used by several area agencies. State crime labs in Missouri, the example would be the Missouri State Highway Patrol's crime lab that serves multiple police departments in the entire state. Federal crime labs exist too, and depending upon what that federal agency investigates, determines what the crime lab does. So the Federal Bureau of Investigation may have a lot of terrorism related evidence flow through. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms deals with a lot of explosives evidence and firearms evidence, and DEA obviously handles a lot of drug evidence. Resources do determine capabilities. The more resources that you have, the better your crime lab usually is, so the federal labs are pretty well funded. But you also have private labs that do work for both the commercial sector, such as DNA testing and things of that nature. Well, at times they also do criminal work too on a contract basis. Let's hope that that doesn't happen. Alright, different procedures. Crime labs, again, what they do is determined on the resources that they have and the mandates that they've been given to do. So fingerprint analysis is common in some labs and not so common in others. Tumor mark and impression, blood analysis is quite expensive, so it has to be a pretty good sized crime lab that actually does blood analysis. DNA is closely related to that too. Toxicology is the study of poisons that we'll talk about later. Again, a sophisticated lab is needed to do that type of work. Trace evidence and also ballistic evaluation or evaluation of evidence from arms. Sherlock Holmes, actually, before crime labs really came into being, and before they became popular anyway, Sherlock Holmes' early work by Arthur Conan Doyle kind of hinted around at some different aspects of crime scene investigation that have come to be true, things such as firearms examination and trace evidence. Hans Gross actually was one of the first pioneers of crime scene investigation who took some of that into reality. Crime scene investigators themselves are typically either police officers or sworn officers or civilians, either of which has to be trained in crime scene investigation. So every police officer receives a rudimentary training in crime scene investigation, but we're talking much more detailed, in depth about how to handle specific pieces of evidence. But there's also some who are not sworn actually are trained as well. An identification officer is another name for an individual who specializes in the processing of fingerprint evidence. So it's not a fingerprint officer, it's an identification officer. So they help collect it, and they may even be involved in the processing or comparison of fingerprints later on down in the crime lab. Forensic surveyors aren't used too much, but occasionally you'll have some sort of disaster or crime that involves an architectural issue, and they can make architectural drawings of scenes and help in that evaluation. You have forensic architects as well, believe it or not. You don't see too many forensic photographers anymore. This is one of those cross training areas, but you still do in the largest crime labs people who specifically work with photography and taking photos. Video audio specialists, obviously, the more video cameras we have in the world, the more video evidence we see. So you tend to see some video audio specialists popping up who can do things like attempt to slightly enhance videos, and enhance is kind of a misnomer that we'll talk about later, but at least they can perhaps make it more viewable. A criminalist or a forensic science, this is somebody who works in a crime lab who works with a variety of different testing methods, including sometimes toxicology and things of that nature. They're kind of general purpose crime scene worker or crime lab workers, pardon me. So essentially you have two different types of people: crime scene workers who actually go to the scene, and crime lab workers who primarily work in the lab. And both of them do the opposite to a lesser scale. Coroner and medical examiner, they obviously respond to the scenes and handle bodies and process them medically to determine cause and manner of death. The difference between a coroner and a medical examiner: a coroner can actually be elected, which is very interesting. A medical examiner is usually appointed. So coroners, by and large, don't have the degree of training that a medical examiner does. That's not always the case. The ME system is a better system in my view. The coroner and medical examiner, their investigation of a death depends upon multiple things, not just the medical examination or the autopsy, but also police reports or what witnesses have said. They may even go to the step of interviewing individuals who were involved in the investigation. They can issue subpoenas in some cases, and if there's no evidence of trauma, that's where the autopsy comes into play. Well, they will look into natural causes. A forensic investigator is somebody who works for the medical examiner's office, who will actually respond to scenes when the medical examiner is not available. So they may be able to do some things at the scene that don't involve medical work, like an autopsy, but they can take some photographs, process some evidence, look for certain signs of death and things like that nature, and report them to the ME. All right, hospital emergency room personnel obviously come into the picture in things such as rape investigations, aggravated assaults. Forensic pathologists may be involved in helping to determine cause of death too. The district attorney is going to prosecute the case. An odontologist, in some cases, there may be an identification possible through dental records. So an odontologist is essentially a forensic dentist. A forensic psychologist or psychiatrist may come into play when you have a serial case, or they may even be able to look at a non-serial murder case. And just the way the scene presents itself, which we'll talk about more in Chapter 16, may give you some indicators about the type of individual that you're looking for. So they may work for what's called the Violent Crime Apprehension Program, or VICAP, through the FBI. That's kind of what they specialize in, examining scenes and trying to come up with an offender profile based upon what they have found. Cadaver dogs and rescue dogs are trained. You can essentially train a dog to search for any smell that you want. If you wanted to train a dog to search for jelly beans, you certainly could. You just have to reward that dog every time they smell and find jelly beans. So the same is true with drugs, and the same is true with bodies. So you can search them, or have them search for the smell of a decomposing human body. Of course, it's a trouble when they lose themselves. Forensic engineers, they are somewhat related to architectural study too. They can kind of look at how things are built and how they may, certain damage may be caused by certain impacts and things of that nature. So a forensic engineer could be used in a disaster scene, for example, to determine how something occurred, such as the Hyatt Regency skywalk collapse. Years ago in Kansas City, Missouri, forensic engineers were used to try to reconstruct the sequence of events there. Forensic audio specialist, we kind of talked about them earlier with audio visual, but they can work on audio recordings too that may come into play. A tool mark examiner is somebody who examines the impact of tools into surfaces and tries to compare them, like in a burglary case or something like that. A document examiner obviously looks at documents, so this could be signatures, it could be all sorts of documents are used in criminal investigations, handwriting analysis, and things of that nature. Trace evidence we'll talk about, but there's a whole unit dedicated to that later in the course. It includes anything that's microscopic, so we're talking human hairs and fibers and wood chips and things of that nature. They are trained in how to handle and compare those. A forensic toxicologist, toxicology, as we'll discuss later, is the study of poisons. So they look for any sort of poisoning that could have occurred in the human body. It doesn't always mean somebody was poisoned to death. They may have accidentally killed themselves with an overdose of medication, and that is a poisoning. So they will look for traces of overdose. They are used in post-mortem examinations, human performance testing in sports, and in urine testing for jobs too. Obviously, a firearms examiner does all sorts of work with firearms, such as comparing recovered spent bullets to the firearm that could have fired them. And they also look at trajectory to see how a bullet may have traveled its path. Skeletal remains are difficult because you don't have much tissue to work with, and it's sometimes tough to determine whether the bones that you have found are human bones. They aren't always laid out as they are here. So a forensic anthropologist can help out in that regard. An entomologist, entomology is the study of insects. When someone dies, it's rather gross, but essentially insects invade the body at a certain rate, and by looking at the age of an insect, you can help determine the approximate time or time of death. So an entomologist can be helpful in that process. Serology is different from toxicology. It's not the study of poisons, but it's the study of bodily fluids. So it could include things like blood, saliva, and semen. So they work with blood to perhaps determine DNA profiles or blood types and that sort of thing. Occasionally you'll have a case where an individual, you find plant matter on a body, and that is where a forensic botanist may come in and say this is the plant matter that was found, and maybe you have a distinctive type of plant at a potential scene that you can match the two together. Lots of health and safety issues related to crime scene investigations. So, a chemical biological terror scene can present some issues, obviously. You have to wear protective gear. In a scene as big as that, it's quite likely that you're going to get lots of federal officials involved in processing the scene, from DHS to the Department of Defense to the FBI. Local agencies, though, are usually the first to respond, so you can imagine the different concerns that would exist with the first responders. Lots of different health and safety concerns, from bloodborne pathogens such as AIDS and hepatitis to allergic reactions from your typical poison plants and insect bites to hantavirus, which is from rodent urine, feces, and saliva. Some of the crime scenes that are worked are quite frankly disgusting. They're really terrible conditions. That may be the reason for the investigation itself. So you have things like Lyme disease, meningitis, all of these that are a big concern. You don't have to study or know what these particular diseases are for purposes of the test, but they're just concerns that you may encounter at a specific crime scene. Tuberculosis, rabies from animals who could be at the scene, somewhat rare, but it does exist. About 5 cases per year cause fatalities in the United States. Rocky Mountain spotted fever, San Joaquin Valley fever, all different concerns that exist. Snake bites in outdoor scenes, spider bites from things like brown recluses. Tetanus is a very common concern. That's why when you go into the emergency room, often they'll ask you if you've had a tetanus shot recently because it can cause even death. So they want to make sure that you've had your shots. Universal precautions, that, and this is important to remember, these are the steps that can be taken to avoid some of those concerns that I discussed. So they are very simple procedures, such as generic hand washing to just wearing appropriate personal protective equipment or PPE, such as gloves, gowns, and masks to protect yourself from the crime scene. So we wore boots when I used to work in processing crime or meth labs. We wore boots on our feet because you never knew when you might track chemicals from the meth lab on your boots into your car, or heaven forbid, even when you go home.